Hi, my name is Nathan, and you are watching Nice at Dice. And today I'm reviewing a board game called Unicornus Knights. This is from a couple of Japanese game designers, but it was brought to the US by AEG. And it's a cooperative game for 2 to 6 players. Basically, the premise of the game is there is a princess who has been ousted from control of her kingdom by an invading emperor. And now she is on a quest to retake the capital. So she's going to travel across the board using a sort of simple AI by which you follow some simple rules, and it controls her movements as she travels across the board, fighting enemies as she goes, getting closer to the capital, where she will eventually battle the emperor and his armies in a bid to take control of the kingdom again. You are her loyal knights and generals and strategists and so forth, and you are trying to facilitate her completing her quest. So some of that involves fighting enemy characters, some of it involves helping her to have the resources that she needs to keep her and her troops moving along. And basically you're restricted to a limited number of turns. You have to complete the game in 10 rounds or you lose, and you have to keep the princess alive. If the princess is ever defeated, then you also lose the game. You win when the princess successfully gets to the capital, defeats all the enemies there, and occupies the city without being defeated and in that limited number of turns. So as I normally do, I'm going to kind of show you a little bit about the game, how it works. I'm going to spend maybe more than the usual amount of time on this because it is a bit complex of a game, not overly so. But one of the challenges that I find with this game is that in the translating of the rules from Japanese to English, there's a lot of ambiguity. And so it took me a little bit of research to figure out all the ins and outs of how the game works. And so I want to try and convey as much of that to you as I can. So we'll go to the table, I'll show you some aspects of the game, how it works, and then I'll come back and give you my thoughts. So here's an overhead view of some of the components of the game. As you can see, you have these sort of hexagon-shaped tiles that you arrange in a pattern like this to create the board. And as you can also probably tell, this game takes up a lot of space on the table. This is just the board. Each player is also going to have a variety of cards in front of them, and you're going to need somewhere to roll the dice, and I can't really even capture the entire board in my camera view. That's just how big it is. So one thing to be aware about the game is it does take up a lot of space on the table. Now, you set up this board somewhat randomly, although there is a certain pattern to it. For example, the princess always starts on this tile here, or I should say the tile that the princess starts on always goes here, and the tile that she's trying to get to is always over here. And then the player characters start on tiles going out like this, and then the rest of the board is occupied by the bad guys. As you can see, there's quite a few things going on. You have various standees on different parts of the board. Just about every tile on the board gets a standee for a character, either a villain or a hero. You have a lot of these little tokens that represent enemy troops. You have different terrain on the tiles, and so there's a lot going on. I'll show you a slightly different angle, a lower angle, so that'll give you maybe a little bit better view of what's going on the board, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of those details there. So from this angle, hopefully you can see a little more detail of what's on these tiles that make up the board. For example, you have roads like here and here. You have some open plains like over here. You have water like here. You have forests. You have a village over here. This character is standing on a fort. You have some mountains. You have desert over here, and so forth. So there's different kinds of terrains, and those terrains have different effects. For example, the roads have this symbol which indicates that movement costs 1 less resource on the roads. This symbol means that movement costs 1 more resource on the forest. Forests also provide 1 defense if you are standing in them and you're being attacked. Or to your enemies if they're standing in the forest and you're attacking them. And you can see there's lots of different characters on the board. These are all enemy characters, except for here's one of the heroes off in the corner over there. And from this angle, hopefully you can see these tokens a little bit better. These tokens are important. They basically represent enemy troops on the board. Some of the enemies are standing on more of these tokens, and so that represents troops that are backing them up. But there are also troops just standing out in various places. So I want to show you some of the basics of what you can do on your turn. On your turn, you get a certain number of actions, anywhere from 3 to 5, depending on the number of players. And with those actions, you can do a number of things. For example, if you're standing on a town like this one, you'll notice that you have this little gray circle with a number in it. So you can use one action to recruit that many troops. You have these troop icons that you keep next to your character's card, and he can have a number of troops equal to the number in this green shield here. So if you had less than, if you were playing this character and you had less than 6 troops, you could recruit 2 troops at a town like that for an action. You also have these resource tokens, and you can have an unlimited number of these, and they're very important, so you want a good number of them at any given time. And you can get more of them if you're, again, in like a town and you have this little icon with a number in it. So you can see there's 5 there. So for one action, he can just gather resources, and that would let him collect 5 tokens and add those to his supply. You can also use an action to send resources and troops to other players who are on your same tile or on an adjacent tile. You can also use an action to move, so you could simply move from one space to another space, but it's not so simple because every time you move, you have to spend resources equal to the number of troops you have. So in order to make that move, he would have to spend 6 resources to do that. Of course, terrain can modify that, like roads require 1 fewer resource to travel on. And if you ever have no troops, you still have to pay a minimum of 1 resource in order to move. Another important thing that you can do as a part of moving is you can attack enemies in the space you're moving into. So for example, if this character was moving into this space where there are some troops, he would have to fight those troops. And I'll show you how that works. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining how combat in this game works, because honestly it's one of the most confusing things about the game, and the rules do not document it very well. So I think it would be helpful if you're interested in the game to have a little bit of a teaching session here, and I can show you how combat actually works. So the way combat works is you're going to have a card that represents your character and his abilities. And on this card, you're going to have a combat table. You're also going to want to think about how many troops you have. That's important. And how many troops you're going up against. So let's take a look at these. We see that we're going up against 4 enemy troops. So the number of troops you have tells you how many dice you're going to roll. And you're just rolling regular 6-sided dice. So let's say we're going up against these guys here with our 6 troops. So we're going to roll 6 dice. And we might come up with some results like, let's see, maybe something like this. So you can see from this table that whether you are attacking or defending with this particular character, any result of a 4, 5, or 6 counts as a hit. So we rolled these dice, and now we're going to assign the dice to the enemy troops. So we'll assign the 6 to that guy, so that counts as a hit. We'll assign another hit against these troops here. We'll take one of these misses and assign it to the other troop there, and we'll take our final miss and we'll assign it to there. Any excess dice don't get assigned. Then we resolve these dice. So you notice that this is a hit against this, so that'll just take him out. This hit against this guy will reduce him. So now there's just 2 troops left there. and then these are both misses. So they account for these troops, but they don't do anything to them. Now, the reason it's important that we have dice to account for these troops is, let's say we only had 3 troops to attack with, and so we only rolled 3 dice. Well, now we'd be left with 1 miss to account for this guy, but no die to account for this guy. So this guy being unaccounted for is going to do 1 damage to us. You can resolve damage in one of 2 ways. You can have your troops absorb the damage, making this 3 go down to 2, or you can keep your troops and you can take damage to your character. Your character has a limited amount of health, and if you ever have damage equal to your health, then the character dies. That doesn't put you out of the game. You can come back into the game with a different character, but it is a bit of a setback. Now, things are a little bit different if you are, instead of just fighting some random troops, you're fighting a character. One thing I'll point out about fighting this particular character is she happens to be in a city, and cities usually provide some defense by way of this blue shield-shaped icon with a number in it. So attacking her in this city means we're going to roll 1 fewer die. Conversely, if enemies were to attack me while I'm in a city, I would roll 1 additional die. But let's resolve this as if I'm attacking her. So she has her character, herself, and then she was also accompanied by 5 enemy troops. So let's say I had 6 troops, and I'm making this attack. I'm going to be rolling 5 dice, because she had that 1 bonus from the city she was standing on. And let's say I roll a couple of hits, maybe a total of 3 hits, and then a miss and a loss. So now we're going to have to assign these dice. So we could, for example, assign 1 hit to him, 1 hit to him. We could take this other hit and assign it to him, assign the miss and the loss as well. And now we see that we will eliminate these 2 guys completely. We will reduce this guy to just 2, and this loss will cause us to take 1 damage, which we could either put on our character, or we could lose one of our troops over here. However, because we're fighting a character, we also have to take into account her card. Her card might have some special abilities on it that we have to account for, but she also has an innate defense value. And so we have to, if we can, assign dice to her innate defense value as well. If we're unable to do that, then we take additional damage equal to the difference. So in this case, if this is what we rolled, we would be using all these dice, getting rid of all these guys. These 2 guys would stick around. We would take 1 damage from this guy, which came up a loss, and we would take 3 more damage from her defense that we didn't even account for at all. So let's say that happens. Let's say we go ahead and we take 3 damage for her, and instead of the 1 damage from this die, we just allow ourselves to lose a troop. So we're down to 5 troops, she's down to 2 troops, and she of course has her innate defense. And we've already taken some damage. So for our next action, we turn around and we attack again. So this time we're going to roll. Let's say we get, we're going to be rolling only 4 dice because we're down a troop. So let's say we get a 6, a 5, a 4, and a 3. Let's just go for that. So we could assign a couple of these hits to these troops, and then we could assign our remaining guys over there. But on the other hand, if we want, we could actually switch it up. Let's say this was a 4. It'll be a better demonstration. So we wound up against the odds with 4 hits in our attack. So we could assign 2 hits to these troops and the other 2 hits to here. We would still take 1 damage because our 2 guys over here doesn't match for 3. Okay. Or on the other hand, we could put 3 hits there and not assign anything to this troop. We'd still take 1 damage because we have a troop that's not accounted for with a die, but we've put 3 hits on her, dealing a nice 3 damage to her. Or, because she needs only 4 hit points in order to take her out, we could actually choose to assign all 4 of these hits to her in order to eliminate her, but now we'll be taking 2 damage from the 2 troops that we're not accounting for. And even though she'll be removed from the board, her 2 troops will still be in the spot where she was, and where we'll have to fight them again. That's basically how combat works, and I also gave you a little overview there about movement, about collecting resources, recruiting more troops, and sharing resources and troops with people around you. There's one other thing that you can do on your turn, and I'll talk about that next. The last type of action that you can perform on your turn, and you can do this only once per turn, is to draw one of these support cards. Each player also starts with one of these cards at the beginning of the game, and they do a variety of things, such as this one lets you choose 1 Empire unit on the same area and move it 1 space twice. So that lets you move enemy units around. Another example would be move the princess 2 spaces in any direction without cost. So it lets you manipulate where the princess goes. This one just lets you get 3 resources. This one you can play during battle, and it lets you add 3 dice when you roll. And then some of them have an ongoing effect like this, such as add 1 battle die when defending, and so forth. So there's a variety of these types of cards, and again, that's one of the actions you can take on your turn, is to draw one of these from the deck. There's also 2 other decks in the game that are probably worth mentioning. You have a deck of fate cards, and fate cards come into play whenever you basically get within a certain proximity of an enemy character. You draw one of these fate cards, and they do different things. Some of them have no effect, but some of them will do things like the character gains 1 troop. That's the enemy character, so it makes that enemy a little bit tougher. This one says, as long as this character is on the map, the princess will now move towards this character instead of the capital. Highest priority. So this one actually changes the way the princess behaves. So she'll start moving towards whatever character just got this card. That'll be an enemy character, instead of moving towards the capital like she normally would. You also have cards like this, Persuasion, which says when this character is defeated, they become the ally of the character who defeated them. So by way of that, you can actually have enemy characters who end up joining your side after you defeat them, which is a pretty nice little thematic touch. And then the final deck of cards, and this is really important, is a deck of event cards. There are quite a few event cards in the game. You don't use all of them when you play. You make a deck of 10 to play with, and they have a different value of 1. And then there's some that have a value of 2, and then you have some with a value of 3. And you arrange them so that the deck is made up of 3 1s, 3 2s, and 4 3s, giving you a total of 10 cards. At the beginning of each round, you're going to turn over one of these cards and you're going to apply its effect. It's usually something negative for the players. And as you get into the 2s, the effects become even more negative. And when you get to the 3s, even more so. And if you get to the bottom of the deck, then that means you have just that final 10th round in which to complete the game. And if you haven't gotten the princess successfully to the capital by the time that 10th round is over, then you have lost the game. So I walked you through quite a bit of the details of the game, but I suppose I should probably outline what generally happens in a round. Basically, you're going to start by pulling one of those cards from the event deck and applying whatever effect it has. Then you're going to each take your turns in order. On your turn, you take those actions that I described. And then the princess gets a turn where she follows certain rules to resolve what she does, moving closer to the capital, fighting enemies as she goes, etc. And then you're going to resolve a turn, like a phase for the enemies. So enemies that are nearby will attack you. Some enemies will move to be closer to you, and then you'll proceed to the next round. So that's kind of a general flow of the game. Now, I will say that I like the components of the game. The little cardboard standees for the characters are nothing special, but they're nice. They have good artwork on them. The artwork overall is pretty cool. Although one of the things that I find a little disconcerting about the artwork is how they have a number of different artists doing the artwork, and I understand there's a lot of illustrations in the game, so that is probably necessary. However, it is just a little strange when, like, for example, just with the heroes in the game, you have a character like this with artwork like that, and you have a character like this with artwork like that. Now, I don't have anything against either style of artwork, but as you can see, they're very different styles of artwork. So it's just a little jarring when you have such dramatically different styles, especially on the same type of card. For example, like this character, there are other cards in the game on like the villain side that are in a similar style, but this is the only hero card in that style. And so that's just a little bit jarring. But overall, that's a minor complaint. I think all of the artwork is pretty good in the game. I enjoy it. I like the tiles that you make the board with, and also the tokens. All of it is a nice thick cardboard, very sturdy. And so it feels like just a good quality production overall. Now, I mentioned the cards, and I think it'd probably be a good time to mention one little nitpick that I have with the game. One of the most confusing things about the game is related to the cards. And I explained this as I was walking you through how combat works. But for example, like here's a hero character and here's a villain character. They both have the same icons on the bottom. They have their health, and then they have this green shield icon with a number. In the case of a hero, that means that that's how many troops they can have at max. That's all that means. In the case of a villain, that's like their innate defense that you have to be able to block with your dice that you roll. So they mean two totally different things, but they're the exact same symbol in the exact same spot on the cards. That's one of the biggest things that made combat confusing for me. So yeah, it's just worth noting, but again, that's one of the reasons why the game is a little hard to get into, is because there's a lot of confusing things like that about the rules, and just the way the rules are written in general is a bit ambiguous. The rulebook does have this very nice like manga style comic in the beginning to kind of give you the backdrop for the story, which is, you know, completely unnecessary, but it's nice. It adds some nice theme to the game. And I will say that I think one of the best things about this game is the way that it has a lot of theme in it. Between the hero cards, which, you know, have a variety of different, you know, characters. You've got like a tactician, you've got a knight, you've got like this half dragon character. So lots of different types of characters. They all have special abilities. They very well fit a lot of the tropes that you expect from kind of the anime style fantasy. And the same thing among the villains. There's lots of different villains, and they fit into a lot of those different tropes. There's two villains that always appear in the game together, and they always appear on the same tile, and they're twins, and you have to defeat them both in the same round, otherwise one will bring the other back. Lots of just little interesting things like that that add a lot of theme to the game and make it feel very engaging in that respect. The fate cards do that too. The fact that like some of these fate cards come up every time you get within a certain proximity of a new villainous character that you haven't, you know, discovered their fate yet, and these fate cards can have a big impact. Some of them do very little, but some of them will, you know, make that character become your ally after you defeat them. That sort of thing. Redeemable villains, you know, are a big part of like this sort of anime fantasy genre. So that's really interesting. I'd say one of the things that is important to know going into this game, I was expecting it to feel kind of like you're on this like epic quest, like you're a group of heroes traveling with this princess and battling villains along the way, that kind of thing. And it is that, but it really feels more like almost like a military war simulation, because much more important than your character's individual abilities is how many resources your character has, how many troops they have with them, and then finding those towns where you can recruit more troops, gather more resources, figuring out who needs more troops and resources, and using your actions to accumulate troops and resources and maybe sending them to somebody else, sending troops and resources to the princess so that she can continue to make progress towards the capital. Those types of actions are very important to the game, and it kind of creates more a sense of like we are generals managing the princess's army rather than we're a band of heroes traveling along with the princess. So more like Lord of the Rings Return of the King than Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Ring, to make that analogy. But if you know that's what you're getting into, then I don't think that's a problem. It's good to know that what to expect from the game. But in any case, if all of that sounds interesting, I will say as far as like a military war simulation style game goes, this one is fantastically thematic. It really dives into that sort of anime fantasy genre and captures that in a really nice way. The game is challenging, and one of the aspects of its challenge is just the random setup of the board. There's kind of a pattern to how you set up the board, but the specific placement of tiles and the specific tiles that come out is somewhat random. And so sometimes you can find yourself facing a much more difficult challenge just because of the tiles that came out and where they're placed on the board. Or sometimes you are fortunate and it's much easier because of how the tiles are placed. So a couple of things about that. One is the game says once you're familiar with the game, you can set up the board however you want to create different scenarios. I would say maybe play like a learning game to sort of get to understand the principles of it, and then for your next couple of games intentionally set up those tiles in a way that will make it a little bit easier for you, at least until you sort of ramp up in your skill level, because otherwise the game can be pretty challenging. Another thing too is with the event deck, that limits you to 10 rounds to complete the game. And sometimes you can complete the game in like 6 or 7 rounds, but sometimes 10 rounds is nowhere near enough rounds. And so they do suggest if you want to adjust the difficulty of the game to add more cards to this deck. I would suggest when you set it up, you have 3 cards that are rank 1, 3 cards that are rank 2, and 4 cards that are rank 3. I would just make it 4 of each. That'll give you 12 rounds, and it gives you a little bit more breathing room before you get into those more difficult rank 3 events. So again, that's just starting out. It's a good way to do it. Or if you are more familiar with the game and you do that random setup of the board, and again, you're familiar enough with the game that you can look at the random setup and be like, man, this is going to be a really difficult setup. Maybe think about adding those couple extra cards into the event deck to give yourself a couple of more rounds. So there's different ways you can kind of tweak the difficulty if you want to do that. But just be aware that depending on the random setup, it could be really easy, I should say relatively easy, or it can be much more difficult. But in any case, the game will offer a pretty good challenge. So those are my thoughts. I like this genre. I think the game does an excellent job capturing the genre. It's a great cooperative game. It's not a small cooperative game. It's not an overly complex cooperative game, but it's kind of like a larger, like medium to larger size game as far as how big it is, as far as like what's involved in the game, the complexity of it, how long it'll take to play, how much there is to learn to get into it. So if that is what you're looking for, if this theme appeals to you, then I definitely recommend Unicornus Knights. Again, my name is Nathan. I know this video was a bit longer than my normal fare, so thank you so much if you've watched it all the way to this point. Hopefully it was informative to you about this particular game. And again, you're watching Nice at Dice, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.